So our normal empathic response, unless we have some serious disability in that realm, is designed to feel for the immediate suffering of somebody. And the more the person or entity, say a pet or whatever, the more they are like us, they are part of our group, our family, the more they are recognized as us instead of them, we feel empathy. If it is them, we don't necessarily feel empathy at all. We can feel much more empathy towards a dog that is like our dog than we can feel for somebody, caught in a war 10,000 miles away, or for that matter, for a bug that is, being killed by some poison that we have put on our crops, for example. So it can be narrowly focused on visible suffering of those that are like us or loved by us or known, they're part of us. And it also can be, we feel this strong response that is very visceral, and our reason may say, don't put attention on this. Don't let it interrupt what you're doing. But we can't help it. It's like, this is somebody is suffering and we need to reach out. And the fact that it is both narrow and powerful makes it very suspect for people who are trying to find rational solutions to our collective problems. It's a distraction. Big empathy is trying to speak to that by saying, you can have an empathic response that is direct to the visible suffering, and you can expand your sense of the us, your sense of your circle of compassion, your circle of care. Einstein talked about we need to expand our circle of care to embrace all life and the whole planet. So this is a big form of empathy. And we recognize that the empathic responses we have to our more immediate entities that we're connected with, lives that we're connected with, may get in the way of addressing those more distant kinds of suffering. And we actively work to balance those, to find ways to be fully human at all those levels, which is not easy. We're not naturally built necessarily to expand. Although I'm not sure how much of that is cultural. I'm speaking largely from our Western, quote unquote, developed societies. But when you hear Native Americans speaking about all my relations, they're meaning all life, and even stretching to the forces of nature. They are living in a familial relationship to all of life, which has implications for how you manifest your empathy. It's like when you kill the deer for food, it's not just, here's a piece of meat. It's like, this is a being. There needs to be some respect for it. This is not something to abuse by cutting it up and wrapping it in plastic and putting it in the meat market, or sending it overseas. This is something, you're dealing with a life there, and it's deserving of respect, even though you know that you need to eat as part of your own life cycle, and that everything else is eating something. So it gets more more complex and more empathic, and more needing to hold bigger energies and bigger concerns as empathy grows bigger. And one of the most interesting modern understandings is the understandings of systems. And we have built complex systems, economic systems, technological systems, communication systems. We create impacts, each of us creates global impacts with no awareness of how much impact and the kind of impact that we're participating and having. It's seldom direct. Sometimes it is, but usually it's sort of suffused into the system. When we are driving our cars, we are transforming the weather. We're not aware of doing that, but we are participating at a large systemic level in doing that. If the systems were designed differently, we would go about meeting our needs in ways that would not be doing that. So part of big empathy is trying to become aware of those larger systemic participatory dynamics so that we can use our reason and our perspective, our bigger perspective, as well as our caring to address those large systems that make it so hard to live a life that doesn't generate suffering elsewhere. Say nothing of generate suffering in ourselves. So that the big empathy stretches us into the systems. It calls us to find out what role are we playing, which children made the chocolate that we are eating, which species are being impacted by buying this particular set of clothes that we're buying. It's like, how are we participating? That's addressed in other patterns here too. How are we participating in what's going on in the world? And can we stretch ourselves to care and to take action based on our reason? It's driven by our care, but it's guided. It's like care is the wind in our sails, and reason is the rudder that helps us steer in the directions that actually make sense in addressing the kinds of suffering or damage that we're seeing. And so much, if the suffering is far away, we don't see it, but sometimes our news brings it to us. But which suffering does the news choose to expose us to? Does our chosen news choose to expose us to? So looking at other forms of information sources to expand what we might respond to. And time, the seventh generation, are we impacting people who have not been born yet, have not even been conceived yet? How are we relating to the future and even to the past? Do we have compassion for slavery? Do we understand what was going on in the distant past that we now may be meeting or expressing the energies that come from that world? To what extent are we empathizing and using our reason to address that reality also? And otherness, is it us? Is it them? Is it alive? Is it material? Are these other life forms actually feeling suffering? There's more and more research that are showing the emotional life, the active, engaged responsiveness of more and more different kinds of life forms, which we thought of as insensate, as not really being able to experience things. Even if they don't have nervous systems, there's more and more signs of kinds of responsiveness and intelligence that are different from ours. And for us to assume that, we can damage and manipulate those entities as if they were totally material and not living responsive systems. We are getting questions raised about that as science expands more and more into its understanding of the responsiveness of life. And of course, the systemic complexity, the fact that there's so many feedback loops and iterations and dynamics going on in our creation. I mean, the fact that one of the biggest things you can do to help climate change is to not eat meat. It's more important than not driving your car. Most people have no idea that that's true. It's also true in terms of preserving water. Massive amounts of water go into creating the meat that we eat. So vegetarian diet, it's not saying everybody should be vegetarian. It's just saying know that that's part of our participation in the systems, and our ability to feel compassion and effective responsibility and exercise holistic forms of reason are dependent on our gaining these understandings of these invisible connections and being able to see through the complexity from our place of cause to the other place of effect, or from the other place of cause to how it affects us. The more we can understand that, the more we can live responsibly and compassionately in the world. Nonviolent communication is a practice of training ourselves to delve into our needs and the needs of other beings, and explore how we can meet those needs together. And there are some people who are stretching nonviolent communication beyond the interpersonal realms into group realms and relationships to natural systems, relationships to whole communities. It's like, how does the sensibility of nonviolent communication stretch to become big empathy? And systems thinking and systems change work are absolutely necessary to do big empathy, because the manifestation of our small empathy, we're going to help us not suffer. By doing that, we can create absolute havoc on others, particularly if we're just trying to be comfortable, and our efforts to be comfortable endanger other species, endanger the planet, endanger other populations. We need to be able to understand what's going on in systems and actively work to change them. And as I mentioned, Einstein's expanding our circle of care to all life is a challenge. The concept of the seventh generation, we got the seventh generation from the American indigenous culture, who are saying any decision that we make should be done with the seventh generation in mind. And there's a certain extent we can do that, and a certain extent we can't, because life is sufficiently complex. The people who invented the automobile had no idea. The people who invented the original computers had no idea, trying to extend our imaginations in these ways. And that's one of the jobs of science fiction, et cetera. Any fiction is there. One of the main purposes of high quality fiction is to expand our empathy to the other, to expand our understanding of our technologies and our societies, so that we can, should we choose, expand our empathy into those directions, to experience the other. What is it like to be the other, so that we can empathize with that person or entity. And that sense of extending our empathy into the seventh generation has become the basis for an emerging movement called generational justice. To what extent are existing generations gaining benefit by colonizing the future, by taking away from unborn generations? How are elders taking away resources from youth? How are everybody on the planet now taking away resources and degrading resources needed by the future? So that's, that whole realm is a manifestation of big empathy. Gifting economics, the sense of what is it like to have an economy that's built primarily on gifting and generosity, where your status comes from a reputation of being generous. And the more generous you are, the more people want to help you. So it's a very different form of security. And that's actually has big empathy kind of embedded in the economic structures, where there's all these rituals of giving, where the interest rate is negative, so you want to get rid of your money as fast as you can. So everybody's trying to get rid of their money because it gets less valuable over time. if there's all these, there's a book called Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein, which brilliantly describes the nature of a gifting economy if it was put to scale. If we actually ran our national and community economies that way, what would it look like? So that's a embedding, as do quality of life indicators, full cost accounting, embedding the damaging costs into the prices of products, internalizing those costs. These are means of taking a big sensibility about preventing and addressing suffering and embedding it into the structures. So people who are not necessarily feeling empathic about people distant in space or time are still behaving in ways that express empathy, which are preventing and reducing, minimizing damage on other lives that we're involved with. So that's something, another part of big empathy is being aware that we can create systems that have the energy of empathy embedded in them, encased in them, so that everybody who happens to be in those systems ends up willy-nilly behaving in empathic ways, even if their emotional response would not be what you normally think of as empathic. Total corporate responsibility is an interesting initiative. It had a little burst and is sort of faded, but embodies a very interesting. It's not just triple bottom line. We are responsible for making our corporate operations ecological and socially responsible and profitable. Those are the three bottom lines. It's beyond that. It's saying we need to change the systems so it's both easier for us to be socially and environmentally responsible, and it's easier for everybody else to be, because very often there are more financial costs to being socially and environmentally responsible that make the whole system biased towards not being socially responsible. The idea of the externalized costs, not full cost accounting. So if we create the rules of the game that make everybody needing to be socially responsible, then everybody can be socially responsible without paying those costs. So it's like having a car company actually lobbying policymakers to create a higher, what do they call it, total fuel economy for their whole fleet. There's I can't remember the statistic for that, but to make fuel efficiency required for everybody. Everybody has to do that. At the point everybody has to do that, individual companies who build cars will not be penalized for doing that. Whereas in some cases they would be if there is no regulation of that. So there's a way in which regulation raises the standard and everybody can function at this higher standard. Restorative justice, which is one of our other cards, embodies big empathy, because the empathy is not just for the victim. The empathy stretches out to the community involvement, the person who did the crime, and more effectively to the victim. The fact is, the victim does not actually get made whole by having somebody put in prison. The victim is made whole by being seen by the victim as for the damage that the victim did, being in positive relationship, for trying to make up for it. Those are the forms of making whole. This is trying to expand our sense of what would reduce the overall suffering in this system of victim-perpetrator community. We're trying to raise it all up. And Paulo Freire is famous for a practice called pedagogy of the oppressed. I remember story of him trying to teach literacy to these poor illiterate people in Brazil, where he's from. Uh, and he would talk to them first about what are the words that are most real in their lives. So, mud. Mud is really real in their lives. Okay, so here's how to spell mud. Here's how to write mud. Now, do you have questions about mud? Why is there so much mud here and there's other communities where there isn't any mud? So this is entering into the dynamics of oppression. And now that you know how to spell the word mud and other words that are tied into the system that generates mud, you can take action. You can now write to your representatives. You can make signs. You can move into the world of activism where you are transforming your oppressive conditions into conditions that are more healthy. So this is a as a social activist and compassionate person, Paulo Freire is expanding. It's the story of teaching a man to fish instead of giving him fish. There's a movement beyond simple, I'm going to stop this person's suffering, to an empowerment to live a life that has less suffering. And there's also, I can't remember the name of the therapy. I heard about it being practiced in Australia, where the indigenous population is, as indigenous populations are in many, many countries around the world, one of the oppressed and marginalized populations. And the therapists who work with them help the people who they were counseling see how incredibly competent and even heroic they were as they worked to survive in an oppressive environment. the other people in the other people in society did not meet nearly the challenges that these people met. And instead of feeling I'm no good, it's like, hey, guy, gal, look at look at what you're dealing with, and look how well under the circumstances you're able to do that. Let's start using some of those capabilities to transform the systems that are oppressing you. It's taking therapy, and instead of I'm going to help this individual, I'm going to help this individual recognize their gifts and power and use those gifts and power to transform the oppressive systems. So that's another expansion of empathy to embrace a much larger world than simply direct person-to-person help. And the last one I'm going to offer here is multiple viewpoint drama, which has its own card in this, its own pattern in this set. And multiple viewpoint drama is saying, and the primo example of this is Anna Deavere Smith's work doing 2 one-woman shows about riots, where she takes on the perspective of these different people who are involved in different parts of the riots, very, very different kind. The cop and the person who hid in their house, and the person throwing stuff and burning stuff in the streets. It's each one has a perspective that makes total sense for them, and to be able to help people expand their sense of the legitimacy of all these different perspectives and all these different lives, given the lives that they have had, the perspectives that have been structured by their experience. And that is, if you're going to be involved in a community that is prone to riots or about to have a riot or affected by riots, to be able to see the multiple viewpoints that go into generating what happens, and to be able to have an empathic relationship to each of those viewpoints. This is taking into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit, which is our working definition of wisdom in the public domain. So that's at large what we're talking about. We're talking about big empathy, is how do we expand our empathic sensibilities so that they actually do take into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit.